Hello, and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today is Friday, June 14th, and today we'll be recapping this week's WNBA action, including the Mystics getting their first win of the season. We'll also discuss some of our biggest risers and fallers in our rankings. And finally, we'll preview the weekend ahead, which includes 3 multi-game slates. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. If you have questions during the show, you can ask them in the comments and we'll get them answered. If they're asked live, we'll talk about them on the show, but you can also ask them afterward and we'll get them answered in the comments. Well, Kirien, the Mystics are on the board with a win, and they got a boost when doing so as Brittney Sykes returned from a lengthy absence. However, she sustained a foot injury in the win and doesn't have a timetable to return. What do we know about the injury?
Well, yeah, congrats to the Mystics. We've been talking about how they played a lot of close games. So, being winless wasn't really like a fair status for them. So glad that they got on the board, but doesn't look good for Sykes, right? Like still doing imaging as of Friday morning, maybe another update this evening, but the team doesn't believe she broke her foot, which I guess is good news, but that doesn't sound like it's, like she's going to be playing next game. I would expect her to miss at least a couple games. Never a good sign when a player like returns from injury and immediately suffers another injury, right? I'd assume that Washington will be have some precautionary measures in line. I'm hopefully, if you're a fantasy manager, you didn't drop Julie Vanloo, because I'm assuming she's going to be right back in the starting lineup and playing pretty heavy minutes moving forward if Sykes does miss extra time.
Yeah, and Eric Tebow, the Mystics coach, was talking about the injury. He said that he thinks that she avoided something major, but the way that he was talking, it sounded like it would be probably a multi-game absence. Hopefully it's not as long as 10 games as it was before, but it's tough because Brittney Sykes is such a talented player, and you could see the boost that she provided to Washington upon her return. So it's definitely unfortunate for Washington.
Yeah, anytime a coach says like avoid something serious, that doesn't mean like they're going to be back next game. That almost always means, well, they avoided something serious, but they're going to miss at least a couple of games. And she just missed 10 games too, so it could be like an issue of like conditioning and everything. I would be staying away from Sykes right now, and hopefully you can throw her back in your IR spot.
Yeah, especially in the WNBA, you never know what you'll get with injury updates, unfortunately. We also set the stage for the Commissioner's Cup Championship last night as the Lynx clinched their spot in the game and will travel to New York on June 25th to face the Liberty. I don't think I would have predicted this matchup heading into the season, especially since the Western Conference has super teams such as the Storm and Mercury, not to mention the back-to-back champions in the Aces. However, Minnesota made several solid offseason signings of their own, including Courtney Williams and Alana Smith, and it's clearly worked out so far. I don't want to dive in too deep to this matchup since we'll probably preview the game as the date draws closer. But on the surface, who do you think hoists the commission up?
I think I got to roll with the Liberty. They've won 7 straight, including handing the Sun their first loss. Most of that winning streak has been without Vandersloot too. Courtney Vandersloot, their point guard. She's missed 3 straight games and 4 of the last 6. Her first absence was due to a back injury, but the way the reporting was, it kind of sounded like that was a veteran's rest day, right? And now she's missed 3 straight games due to personal reasons. Vandersloot did play when New York played Minnesota on May 25th, which was a blowout win by Minnesota. They won by 17 points, held Jonquel Jones to only 4 points. But I think it would be a little bit different in a Commissioner's Cup championship setting. I would expect Jonquel to like bounce back and have a really good game. And Kayla McBride has just been on fire recently. So, there's always the caveat that she could hit 10 threes and lead Minnesota to victory. But I just really like the way that New York is playing right now. Their stars are playing well without like having to do a ton. And then you got some of their bench players, Leonie Fiebich, Kennedy Burke, Kayla Thornton. They've all like had moments and stepped up in big opportunities. So I feel like the Liberty are really able to play a lot of different games with how strong their bench is, with having different options off the bench. And then obviously, you got Breanna Stewart and Jonquel and Sabrina Ionescu leading the way. So I probably would roll with the Liberty just with the way they've been playing right now.
Yeah, again, it's still early and things can happen between now and then, but I don't know, don't overlook the links. I think that it'll be an entertaining matchup for sure. Finally, we had some encouraging news from the Aces last night as Chelsea Gray was listed on the active roster. She didn't take the court during the team's win over Phoenix, but this seems to signal that she's very close to returning. If Gray returns this weekend or sometime next week, what do we think that means for the fantasy value of some other players on the Aces?
Well, yeah, before we get too far into it, it was just the reporting was kind of weird. A couple days ago, she was like, well, I'll be back before the Olympic break, which isn't for another month plus. So it was like, well, that's concerning. Does that mean she's going to miss 2 more weeks? Does that mean she's going to miss another week? Does that mean she's going to miss 3 more weeks and just return for like a final game before the Olympic break? And then she was immediately upgraded to questionable like the next day. So really encouraging signs for managers that have been stashing Gray so far. If you have been stashing her, like I have been in a couple leagues, I'm still holding her on IR, but as soon as she gets that green light, you got to clear her, throw her in the starting lineup. She may be limited at first, but she's such a prolific player that you're going to want her in the lineup as soon as she's active. As for the other aces, I think it may mean the end for Kate Martin's fantasy window. After starting for Jackie Young and playing 32 minutes, the rookie has played 15 minutes and then 9 minutes, while Tiffany Hayes has played over 20 minutes in every appearance thus far, and Sydney Colson is starting to carve out more playing time too. So, like, while the Kate Martin story was nice, and I think she is a solid player and will continue to have a role, the Aces have been struggling. They pulled out a win last night, which I didn't think they were going to for a long portion of that game. But I think the Aces are going to need to make some moves, and that may mean less developmental minutes for the rookie. Going off of that, I would also think that Kia Stokes would be the one who's likely pushed to the bench to make room for Gray. Stokes has played fewer than 20 minutes in 3 straight games despite being a starter. For reference, Alyssa Clark, who would be the other person who would move to the bench for Gray, has played fewer than 30 minutes only 3 times all season. So I feel like Clark is probably going to remain that 5th starter. Gray will replace Stokes.
Yeah, I think that there's a chance that Kia Stokes stays in the starting lineup because she drew most of the starts last year in Candace Parker's absence. But if you had to give me a choice between Kia Stokes and Alicia Clark, even if Clark is coming off the bench, I think I still prefer her. They've clearly shown like more usage for Clark so far, and she seems to be the better fantasy option, even if Stokes does like remain in the starting lineup. Before we move on to our next section, if you like content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Let's move on to talk about players who we think can improve fantasy rosters and players it might be time to move on from. Now that we're a month into the season, we can get a better idea of what a player's value could be for the remainder of the year. Starting off, one player who has been a riser for me recently has been Bridget Carleton, forward for the Lynx. She's retained a starting role even as Dorka Juhas has been available, and Carleton has scored in double figures in 3 of her last 4 appearances. She's averaged 3.3 made 3-pointers per during that stretch, and she's generated her solid production against some solid opponents as she scored in double figures against the Aces, Storm, and Sparks. She's been a pretty steady option over the first month of the season, but it's encouraging to see her upside on full display over the last week and a half. Dorka Juhas has seemed to be limited by a knee injury recently, but it seems as though both players will be able to have roles when Juhas is fully healthy, and if one of them takes more of a back seat, I would probably say that it would be more likely to be Juhas having less usage and Carleton having more. Carleton isn't the most traditional forward option, as she isn't stellar on the boards or with stocks. But in point based fantasy, like we play on ESPN, it doesn't matter how the production is occurring as much as long as we're getting it somehow. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was coughing a little bit earlier. But I
Oh,
think
all good.
the key part with Carleton is the 3.5 or 3.3 threes per game, right? That's where the upside is. And I think that is sustainable because, you got Courtney Williams, Elena Smith, and Nafisa Collier, who are really strong and they draw a lot of attention, right? So Carleton's kind of like, she can make that 3, but I feel like a lot of teams are going to be willing to give up that 3 as opposed to like giving up easy baskets over and over again. So I think like we talk about 3-point shooting has the upside, but that also normally means that you're a pretty streaky fantasy player. But I think Carleton is one of the safer upside 3-and-D players just because she plays with a lot of players that draw a bunch of attention.
Yeah, and a lot of times with front court options, you'll see them. They'll get the ball beyond the arc. They'll be open. Maybe they'll shoot a three. But Carleton's 3-point attempts so far this season have doubled from the past 3 years. The past 3 years, it was 2.3 in every season per game, and now it's 4.6. And she's shooting 41.8% from long distance. So clearly something is working for her. So I think that as long as she continues to have a hot hand, the Lynx will keep rolling with her.
Yeah, and the Lynx are winning a bunch of games, so might as well keep rolling with her.
Absolutely.
My riser is Aari McDonald, guard for the Sparks. We talked about her a little on Monday. She's posted at least 15 points, 2 rebounds, 2 assists, and 1 steal in back-to-back games. Over her last 8 appearances, she's averaging 10 points, 3 assists, 2.5 rebounds, and a steals in 23.5 minutes per game. She continues to operate off the bench despite seeing more minutes. And she's starting to like slowly steal minutes away from Kia Nurse, who played only 4 minutes last time out, and Leonie Fiebich. McDonald probably isn't like a season-long hold, but like at this point with the production she's having, I'm streaming her wherever I can.
Yeah, I agree with you on this one. The Sparks have been a little bit inconsistent to start the season in terms of how they've used their rotation. You look at case in point, Leonie Fiebich started the season with the triple-double, and we're like, is this maybe the rise of Leonie Fiebich? But Dearica Hamby has been the player to shoulder most of the load for LA, but there's still been a lot of production to go around, and Aari McDonald has been the beneficiary. So in recent games, she scored at least 10 ESPN fantasy points in 8 consecutive games, which is probably a player that you want on your roster, because I think that there are a lot of players that we talk about who are free agency pickups who are maybe like have that upside, but they also have those games where they're pretty close to the bottom and maybe like 5 ESPN fantasy points. So if you can get that consistent production, that's a really beneficial thing from the waiver wire.
Yeah, and like we've said with Kia Nurse and other guards in Los Angeles, that guard rotation continues to fluctuate per every week. But you got to take advantage when the production is there.
Yep, absolutely. On the flip side, one faller for me recently has been Dana Evans, guard from the Sky. She's played under 27 minutes in 3 of her last 4 games and has simply not had much upside in recent matchups. She's been held under 15 ESPN fantasy points in 3 of her last 4 appearances. Her downturn in usage isn't necessarily due to her talent and what she's displayed. Instead, Kennedy Carter has provided such a spark off the bench, and the Sky also have several front court players to incorporate, including Isabel Harrison. Evans has really earned her starting role this season, and it seems likely that it'll continue as the year rolls on. She's someone who has come off the bench a lot in the past, but has provided a spark for the team, kind of similar to what Kennedy Carter is doing this season. But Evans has really stepped into her starting role well, and I think has earned it. However, Evans has had a decrease in shot volume recently and doesn't really have the production in other categories to maintain fantasy value if her scoring is regularly.
Yeah, I think Evans is one of those classic examples of a player that probably brings more value to a team's like actual success in real life than in terms of fantasy. I was on Evans going into this season. I think she showed that she can put up production, but now that she's like a full-time starter, she doesn't need to like maybe like make as big of an impression in the statistical sense like every game, and she just needs to keep making winning plays to maintain that role. And that, you know, that sucks for fantasy. Like I think she, like you said, I think she'll continue to start because she is a good basketball player and she makes winning plays. But that fantasy upside just isn't there right now. And then you got players like Angel Reese, Camila Cardoso, who are going to start taking on a bigger role, a bigger leadership role, expecting to do more as the season goes on. And just like kind of seeing how high those players' ceilings are will limit the other role players around. And I feel like Evans, we thought maybe had a chance to like, maybe not turn into a star, but turn into like an above average player. And right now it kind of seems like she's just going to be like a role player for a young team, and the youngsters are going to take that leading role in the shot attempts and so forth. And, you know, which is
Right.
which is terrible for fantasy.
Right. With how many players we saw leave the sky during the offseason, including Kalia Copper, Courtney Williams, Alana Smith, it felt like Dana Evans would be that player to take the next step. And to a certain extent, she has. She's had pretty
Yeah.
solid production. But when it comes to the value that's available elsewhere, I think that Evans just kind of goes by the wayside in fantasy a little bit. And she's still a player who's worth streaming if you need someone, but I don't think that she's a player that you necessarily need to have on your roster throughout the season. And I think heading into the year, we thought that that would be a little bit more of her role, that she would be someone worth keeping around. But it's always good to have a good streaming option available on waivers as well.
Yeah, 100% agree with those sentiments. So moving to my faller, it would be Kia Nurse. I'm sticking with the guards in Los Angeles. Kind of mentioned it when I was talking about Aari McDonald, right? Nurse scored 23 points in the season opener. She averaged 13 points per game over her first 8 appearances this season. However, she scored just 13 total points over her last 4 appearances. I feel like that's the definition of a faller. She's falling off a cliff right now. Her production is just not there. And even worse, she's playing fewer than 20 minutes in each of those 4 appearances, including a season low 4 minutes versus Seattle on Tuesday. So oftentimes we talk about, production versus like the opportunity, right? And for a while, Nurse's production was dropping, but the opportunities were still there. And now both are dropping. And I don't think that you can really keep her rostered at this point. It's 4 minutes is just not enough. I don't think she'll be playing 4 minutes consistently, but I don't think she's going to be playing 20 plus minutes anytime soon. And obviously when that does change, and maybe like we said, the Sparks guard rotation has been fluctuating. So, maybe in a week or two, she does. But for now, I think Kia Nurse is a drop in most leagues.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talk about a lot in fantasy in general is just sunk cost, where you have a player on your roster, they've contributed a lot in the past, and you try and keep them around because they've provided that value, and you made that call early in the season that I'm going to roll with Kia Nurse. She's been good, but in recent weeks, the production simply hasn't been there. She dealt with a knee injury a little bit, but her downturn in production, I think, is just a product of the way that the Sparks are doing business this year, and that they're testing a few options out. And right now, Nurse seems to be on the outs, even though she's retained a starting role. Maybe at some point her playing time rises again, but I think that that's a conversation to be had down the road. And I have no reservations about getting rid of her at this point.
Yeah, you can't count on a player that just played 4 minutes. There's a lot of players on waivers that are playing at least double-digit minutes. So it's just a tough situation for Kia Nurse right now.
Yeah, and especially with WNBA fantasy, where the regular season is maybe spans 28 or so, like games for the WNBA. So you have to make every week count all that much more, and Kia Nurse just isn't doing it right now. Adding on one more faller, I think that I am about ready to move on from Shakira Austin, center for the Mystics, especially if I have another player occupying my IR spot. Austin has been very efficient when on the court this year, but she's in the midst of a multi-game absence, and coach Eric Thibault doesn't seem to know when she'll be cleared to return. Thibault is talking about her recovery process as being inconsistent, so it seems as though her injury is something that will be heavily monitored even when she's cleared to return. I'm probably fine dropping her in 6 to 18 leagues where I have her. But Kieran, do you think that there's any value in trying to pursue a trade? She feels a little bit like one of those players who you might be able to pick up once again off free agency when she's cleared to return, and her trade value kind of seems to be at an all-time low.
Yeah, we talked about it. I think it was Monday or maybe last Friday about like how I view trades and how I attack trades. If I have an IR spot open, I'm 100% trying to make a trade for Shakira Austin right now. If I don't, I would probably be waiting for the player to drop her and get her for nothing. Because I don't really want to give up like any tangible production at this point. And whoever is owning her, we're probably, like you said, sunken cost is probably like, well, I'm not just going to give her away for anything. So if I had an IR spot, I'm definitely trying to make a trade. And I may be willing to give up a player of some sort of value. But if I don't, I'm not going to try to like trade a player that's giving me consistent production for, and you're going to have to give up something, right? For that. So I'm not going to give up a player that is providing me consistent production so I can get Austin to sit on my bench, unless I'm like undefeated and maybe I have a 2 or 3 game lead on everyone else. Like you said, the WNBA fantasy season, regular season is only 10 weeks or so. So if you already have a big lead and you are literally just playing for the playoffs, possibly. The other caveat with this whole conversation is that like the Mystics have a rookie big that they're going to want to give a bunch of minutes to, right? So while we think Shakira Austin, has an upside and they want to get her back on the court, there's really no like reason to push her when you can just give Aaliyah Edwards 30 minutes and see what happens. Like we said, the Mystics only have 1 win this season, so developmental minutes are going to be a thing that are going to that they're probably already a thing. They're probably not going to make the playoffs. So I don't really see any reason for Washington to push her back, which makes me hesitate to give up anything of value for her.
Right. And she has been efficient when on the court, as I said, but
she's been fantastic. She was fantastic. Even in limited minutes to start the season, she was fantastic.
Right. And she also dealt with her hip injury last year, and which was her biggest drawback. And she underwent surgery in, I think, November. So I had hoped that she would be kind of past the issue. But the way that Eric Tebow is talking about it, it feels like this will be another lingering thing over the season where even when she's available, she's still having her playing time monitored. So she's proven that she can have that solid fantasy production even when she's on the court. But if I have her in a 10-team league, it feels like I'm in a bit of a rock in between a rock and a hard place where you don't really want to drop her in that deep of a league, but also she isn't carrying much value on your roster, especially if you have another player who's hurt right now.
Yeah, it's super tough situation. And I love the upside of Shakira Austin. I think even if she's playing 20 minutes, she can make an impact in the fantasy playoffs this year. But I'm like 50-50 that will happen. So, that probably puts me at like a 30% want to trade for her, which probably means wait for whoever has her to make the tough decision to drop her and then swoop in and take her for nothing.
Right. Yeah. So she isn't necessarily a must drop player at this point, but certainly worth keeping an eye on. And she's someone who, if you are deciding to part ways with her, I don't think that it's out of the ordinary. I don't think that'll turn too many heads in your league.
And you got to think that if you are rostering her, you probably drafted her in one of the middle rounds, and your team's probably taking a pretty big hit with her in and out of the lineup and playing limited minutes. So whoever has her rostered in your league is probably like, well, I got to find some production, and it might be willing to drop her. But if you have obviously a decent record, there's no real reason to drop her. Might as well continue to roll with what you have been rolling with, and hopefully she returns. Mm-hmm. So my next riser is Nia Coffey, forward for the Atlanta Dream. Coffey replaced Cheyenne Parker-Tyus on the starting lineup on Thursday. Parker still had a good game off the bench, so this may be a one-time thing, but Coffey played a season-high 23 minutes. Her previous high before that was 18, and then her next highest was 13, which she did a couple times. So she like almost nearly doubled her usual minute total. Even if Coffey moves back to the bench and Parker-Tyus gets moved into the starting lineup again because it was just like a situational thing, I still think Coffey is starting to carve out more and more of a role in Coach Tanisha Wright's lineup, and it's like she needs to get, and if Coffey's getting 20 plus minutes, that's the opportunity that fantasy managers need. And I feel like that she's a perfect streaming candidate. If a player like Coffey's skill set who can, grab a couple boards, dish out some assists, make some easy buckets, get some defensive production, that type of all-around skill set, all she needs is that opportunity, and she becomes a perfect streaming candidate.
Oh, absolutely. And she's rostered in just 2.4% of ESPN fantasy leagues right now. So she's available basically everywhere. And she had 20 fantasy points off the bench on Tuesday and 15 last night. So if she continues to put up those double-digit totals, and she's someone who's available in basically all leagues that you're in, she's definitely worth considering. And you probably have someone at the end of your bench if you're in a 10-team league who hasn't necessarily been pulling a lot of weight recently, and Coffey is one of the perfect players to replace her.
Yeah, and we talked so much about like streaming and just having your more players play per week. We talked about this week being a week where there was not very many games across the league, right? And so like this is a situation where an extra game or two from a streaming a player like Coffey in could be the difference in a fantasy matchup. And like we said, there's only 10 weeks, so a win by sneaking Nia Coffey into your lineup a couple times would be huge.
Yeah, and a lot of times we'll talk about these players as more speculative as far as we don't know if they can sustain it over a full season. With Coffey, she has in the past. Over the past 2 years, she averaged 6.7 points and 5 rebounds in 21.4 minutes per game. So she's proven that she's capable of handling that solid workload for Atlanta. So maybe she'll get the chance to really prove herself again this year. Another deep sleeper to finish out with is Leonie Fiebich. We briefly touched upon her earlier. She's a forward for the Liberty, and she at least warrants consideration in 10-team leagues. She scored in double figures just twice this season, but has also shown some glimpses of production through rebounds and assists. She seems unlikely to be a consistent contributor due to the amount of talent around her. But for the instances where you may be searching for a streaming candidate just to get a few extra points as the week winds down, maybe you're in a close matchup heading into Saturday or Sunday, Fiebich could be that player. She's rostered in just 2% of ESPN fantasy leagues, so she's available basically everywhere. And yeah, it seems unlikely that she would be more of a consistent player, like not like Coffey might be, but with Fiebich, if you're streaming her for a game when you're just looking for a few extra points, I think she's one of the perfect players to do so with.
Yeah, Fiebich is a rookie this year in the WNBA, right? She played overseas for a bunch of time. She's a super skilled offensive player. I don't even know how else to describe it. She can do almost anything on a basketball court. This may be a huge stretch, and roast me in the comments or whatever, but she has a similar game to Elena Delle Donne. I'm not saying that she is Elena Delle Donne. I'm not saying she's an MVP candidate, but that's the type of player that like offensive skill set she has. And like you said, there's a lot of Jonquel Jones, Breanna Stewart, Sabrina Ionescu. They're going to dominate all of the touches. It's going to be hard for her to make an impact. But if she can carve out the role as like that sixth woman who just comes in and provides the offensive spark, she can be a consistent fantasy player. And I think the biggest piece of her rise is Courtney Vandersloot missing time, right? If Courtney Vandersloot comes back, there's going to be less bench minutes to go around overall. But while Vandersloot is out, I love Fiebich as a high upside play. The Liberty have won 7 straight. They continue to blow teams out. More minutes for Fiebich, more opportunity for a super talented player.
Yeah, and if the Liberty do kind of pull ahead in the standings as the season rolls on, it feels likely that they might be able to give some of their key players like Courtney Vandersloot, like some of their other players, a few more minutes off. So Fiebich is one of those players who it feels like they want to have fill that void when they do need extra minutes. And she's performed well when she's had the opportunities this year. So I think definitely worth keeping an eye on in fantasy.
100% agree. And obviously, comparing her to Elena Delle Donne, I agree that I wanted a reason to talk about her on the show. She early parts of the season, she wasn't carving on a roll. Last couple games have been super solid.
Yeah, here's that opportunity, and hopefully it continues.
Yeah.
So moving on to our final segment, now that the Commissioner's Cup is behind us, let's move on to talk about some of the things that we're looking forward to this weekend.
I mean, starting tonight, I'm excited to watch a bunch of rookie front court players play, go at it. We got Angel Reese and Camila Cardoso versus Aaliyah Edwards. We've talked about how all 3 of those players should have increasing roles as the season goes on. Good opportunity for them to match up and iron sharpens iron type of deal. See who comes out on top. That'll be a fun one to watch. And then in the other game, we got Cameron Brink and Rickea Jackson versus a really tough front court in Minnesota in Leonie Fiebich and Elena Smith. So we'll see what the Sparks youngsters can do against one of the best teams in the W.
Yeah, a lot of really intriguing players tonight, and we haven't released our betting article yet, but I'm assuming there will be a lot of player props with how much talent is out there for tonight. On Saturday, we have a rematch of the 2023 WNBA Finals with a rematch between the Liberty and the Aces. The game will be played in Las Vegas and comes at an interesting time as the Aces have largely struggled recently, but are coming off a win over the Mercury. I think that the biggest X factor in this game will be whether Chelsea Gray is actually able to play for the Aces. If she takes the court, it seems unlikely that she'd be able to handle a full workload, but it seems as though her presence is badly needed for Las Vegas, who are in a different situation than usual as the losses have piled up for them.
Yeah, Aces, like I said earlier in the show, I thought they were pretty lucky to pull out the win last night. It could have been another loss. Super tough test for them. Exciting to watch. I'm skipping forward to Sunday, though. We got Kennedy Carter versus Caitlin Clark, the rematch. Hopefully there's no technical fouls in this one, but I do expect a lot of physical play, a lot of shot making from those two skilled offensive players. We've talked about how Carter is no slouch offensively. She's a very good player, and glad to see her have a role again. Clark is coming off a dud, but the Fever got a win, so it'll be interesting to see how aggressive she is. I don't really think I need to say much more else. It's Kennedy Carter versus Caitlin Clark. That was talked about on CNN for cripe's sake, man. That story went all over the globe. So super exciting matchup, and excited to see what happens.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of eyes on that matchup. And the Sky are probably one of the teams that I'm most intrigued to see how they finish out the weekend. They've struggled as June has gone on, but they have matchups against the Mystics and Fever, which both seem like winnable, quote unquote, winnable matchups. As we've talked about a lot, there are no easy matchups in the WNBA, but if the Sky do lose one or both of these games, it feels like they maybe shift from a team that we're talking about as a playoff contender to how can they finish out the season on a relatively solid note and maybe compete for the playoffs, but probably not make an impact.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast the team goes from, well, they won't be very competitive to, okay, they need to take care of business this weekend. And I think you nailed it. That's right where the position the Sky are in now. Those are winnable games. Given how they played early in the season, they should win these games. But there's a reason the games are played, and you got to go up against Caitlin Clark. You got to go up against Aaliyah Boston, who just had a career high night. So should be a fun matchup.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that does it for our Friday show. We'll be back again Monday at 1 p.m. Central to offer some waiver targets for the week ahead. Thanks for watching.